Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am so excited to have this conversation with Delita Martin. As you have experienced through her work, what an amazing talent she is, and it is an honor and a privilege for me to work with her and represent her. She is as beautiful an individual as is expressed through her work. So I want to just read a brief excerpt from her statement, just to put her work into context. Today's conversation is going to be one about her artistic journey. And if you're planning to join us tomorrow, it will be primarily focused on her personal journey and the inspiration and influence of the film Daughters of the Dust. So to begin, working from oral traditions, vintage and family photos as a source of inspiration, Martin's work explores the power of the narrative impulse. Her process of layering various printmaking, drawing, sewing, collaging, and painting techniques allow her to create portraits that fuse the real and the fantastic. In her work, she combines signs and symbols to create visual language. By fusing this visual language with oral storytelling, she offers other identities and other narratives for women of color. Welcome, Delita Martin.
Thank you.
So I want to begin by talking about this piece, New Beginnings. And delving into your life, your father was an artist, and I want you to share with us what his influence was on you developing along that path.
Yes, first of all, thank you all for coming, and Myrtis, thank you for having me. I really grew up, I joke around with my friends, but it's really true. I grew up in an art school, really. My entire family, they were very creative people. My father was an oil painter, and he actually made furniture as well. His day job, he was a master plumber. That's what he did to sustain our family. But creativity, you had storytellers, you had quilt makers, you had everyone pretty much could draw. And so growing up, creating was just something that you did on a daily basis. So I didn't know any other way of being other than being this creative person. I would literally draw on everything. Crayons were everywhere, and I never got in trouble for it. And it's funny to look back on that when you colored on the wall and your parents don't say anything about it. They're just like, whatever. So yeah, I pretty much grew up in an art school, and I remember actually working with my dad. And I think I knew he was an artist, but I think elementary school was when I really understood he was an artist and began to really look at his work. I remember sitting with him for hours, and he would draw and I would be drawing, and I'd look over at his work and I'm like, wait a minute, mine don't look like that. So I have all these papers like torn up and balled up over here because my work didn't look like his. So I was constantly challenging myself, but he would never say anything. He'd just continue what he was doing, and I'm like, this isn't right, let me try it again. So you know, I had this sense of needing to create, being around creativity all of my life.
And what about your mother?
My mother was not, or is not an artist, but she was very creative in the sense that she loved to go to garage sales and resale stores, which I love to do. And so she'd come home with like a box of something. She would always adorn it with something. So she's gluing things on it and she's creating things with it. And so she never really thought of herself as an artist. And I asked her several years ago, I was like, Mom, why weren't you an artist? She was like, well, I just never really thought about it. I just like pretty things. And so she was always, I call her a collage artist really, because she's always adding that extra something. Whenever she purchased something or we'd have something around the house, she would decorate it and, you know, add a little sparkle to it. So again, just this whole sense of you know, your whole life being this creative process.
But you shared with me that your mother always knew you were going to be an artist.
Yes. It was really interesting. I remember the first time that I really thought about art. I was in kindergarten and we were given these coloring sheets. And I was trying to blend crayon colors together so that I could get this range of colors. And my kindergarten teacher suggested that to the other kids that they look at my colors to get some ideas. And I was like, wow, I really like this. This is cool. And so my friends were like, oh, that's really nice. So my mother would always introduce me when people come over, you introduce your child, this is my daughter. Well, she'd say, this is my artist, this is my baby, and she's an artist. So I thought I was an artist. I was like, oh. So when people would ask me, I'm like, I'm an artist, I'm going to be an artist. I had no other sense. There was never a plan B for what I was going to do. And, no one told me how much it paid or anything. I was so it was recognized early on so that, speaking things, when you talk about speaking things into life, into existence, that's what my parents and my family did. Everyone always called me an artist. They recognized that I was an artist. And so, again, there was just never a plan B for that.
And share with us your encounter with John Biggers. He was a friend of your father's.
Yes, my father actually went to Texas Southern University and he studied with Dr. Biggers. And so that was my introduction to African American artists and seeing artists who created work that looked like me. So, I grew up in Conroe, Texas, predominantly white. You're the only black kid in your classroom. And so, you just don't see images that look like you. And so my father comes home one day, he had me pack up my work, and I made a portfolio out of 2 pieces of poster board that was taped together, and he didn't tell me where we were going. And I think I had to be around 11 or 12 or so. And he didn't tell me where we were going, and we drove to Texas Southern University, and he introduced me to Dr. Biggers, and he critiqued my work. And at that age, I'm thinking to myself, who can I tell that would understand what I'm talking about? Because no one else, my age was thinking in that way. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm sitting here, I'm talking to John Biggers. And at that moment, I'm like, I'm going to Texas Southern University. I'm going to study with Dr. Biggers, and that's just that. Well, I did get to Texas Southern University. He had retired by the time I got there. But he told me something that really stuck with me and resonated in my studio practice. And every day when I walk into my studio, I remember him telling me, don't ever miss an opportunity to uplift your people through your work. And that's something that I try and think about whenever I'm working, and regardless of what I do, really. And that just stuck with me. And I'm like, this 11, 12-year-old little girl thinking, who can I tell that would realize who I'm talking to right now? But that critique really, it really resonated with me, and it really gave me a feeling that I can really do this. It gave me a sense of seeing someone do it, seeing him uplift the people. People in his work looked like the people that I woke up with every day. The head wraps, the dresses, the community, playing outside in the streets with my cousins, being in the country with my cousins, and having those images being uplifted and not being seen as a sense of shame. It really made a difference in my life and made me think about really uplifting my people in my work and not being ashamed of where I come from.
And so you went on to earn a formal education.
Yes.
In art, your MFA. So tell us about your path, your education, and the impact those decisions had on your family.
Well, I got my undergraduate degree at Texas Southern University in Houston. Really excited, and I tell people, Texas Southern taught me how to be an artist. It taught me how to soul search, how to really put yourself, your soul, your spirit, and everything that you have into your work. And I later went on to Purdue University, and I feel like they taught me how to be a professional artist. And it's interesting how you go from, you know, university to university. It varies in the sense of what they teach you and what you take from them. So I was really fortunate to be able to have those two learning bases and be able to bring them together to form the artist that I am today. Undergraduate was, you know, a pretty amazing experience in working with the professors at Texas Southern University. Graduate school was a real challenge. I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, but I wanted to be a printmaker, and I had never actually made a print before because our printmaking class never actually had enough students to make at Texas Southern University. And so going into graduate school, I had a choice between IU and Purdue, and I sent them both email, and I said, whoever gets back with me first. And Purdue emailed me back in 30 minutes, and I was like, Purdue it is. And so we set up an interview, and I went in, and the lead professor for printmaking, Catherine Reed, she was absolutely phenomenal. And she says, well, we're going to get you in, and, you know, it's going to be great. So it was really challenging. It was a challenging program in that I did not have printmaking experience at the time. So I would sit in on undergraduate classes during the daytime to learn process, and I would work on my conceptual work at night. So it was difficult trying to figure out how to marry the two together, how to bring my drawing into printmaking. So it was the other challenge to that graduate degree was the sacrifices that my family made. My husband and my son have been absolutely phenomenal, and it's really important when you take on challenges in life that you have that support system, and he was an amazing support system for me. So, you know, it wasn't just the financial part of it. It was also the sacrifice of having a 3-year-old son and driving an hour every day, you know, an hour to school and an hour home. So it was almost like, I mean, I applaud him. It was like being a single parent for 3 years. So I, you know, take my hat off to this guy. And it was just really challenging coming home. I remember coming home and my, you know, some evenings falling asleep on the couch, and I wake up and I have an entire freeway of Matchbox cars lining my body. You know, he's playing with me and I'm sleeping. But it was a really good experience. It was a sacrifice in terms of, you know, family time that we spent together. I drove an hour to school, and I was usually there. I would get to school probably about 6 in the morning, and I wouldn't get home until 12 o'clock sometimes. And it was just, you know, it was 3 years of making those types of sacrifices, and it was well worth it. And I was blessed enough to have a fantastic support system for that.
So talk to us a little bit about the discipline in your studio practice.
Yes. I am an early morning person, so the earlier I'm in the studio, the better it is for me. I'm usually, if I'm not already working, I usually shut down about 3 o'clock mentally. But I'm in the studio early in the morning. My son goes to school. I grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and I get in the studio and I work. When I go into the studio, I work as intuitively as possible. I don't like to go in with a plan. So I usually say, well, I'm going to work with a full figure today, or I want to do something with just the bust area or something like that. And that's pretty much as far as I get in terms of planning. So when I work with the patterns that I work with and the colors, each step for me informs the next step. So I can, you know, start off with a slight plan as to how I'm going to start, but how it ends up, I don't know. I believe in having a relationship with my work, and I believe that the work always tells me where it's going and where it needs to be. So because of that, I'm able to have more of a relationship with the work, and it's more intimate.
So dissect this piece for us. It's blocked by the screen, so I wanted to start with this New Beginnings piece and have you just contextualize it for us, talk about the various layers that we're looking at.
So this particular piece is, it was really during a time when I go through these phases when I sit down and I look at my work and I'm like, okay, I'm having this conversation. What can I do, or what can I bring into the work to take the conversation further? You know, how can I do that? So this background, or the background of the flower, is actually, the pattern that I use is different than earlier patterns that you would see work prior to this. In that I was thinking about, how do I redefine the space? How do I talk about the space in a different way? I was using tighter patterns that were, I guess, less refined than the patterns that you see here. So that was one way of rethinking that. I love to work large, so this piece is a really large piece. And I like to work large because it changes the space. It changes the conversation with the work. So at that point, are you the viewer or are you being viewed? It changes that conversation, and the work becomes confrontational in the sense that it has a presence. You will see that presence will be known. Particularly when you're talking about African American women, a group that has been marginalized since the beginning. In my work, I want the voices to be heard. And so size helps me to do that. Process, I always start with the background pattern, and that's either painted or it's gelatin print, or in this particular case, the background is actually an acrylic paint. Then you see the blue fruit that you see on there. That is a oil-based ink print, linoleum cut print that I use. The patterns on the dress, actually it's a self-portrait of me. I'm actually holding the mask. That piece is a stencil that was actually cut from mylar. And so I used that as a pattern on the dress. The skirt that I am wearing is decorative papers. I started collecting handmade papers several years ago, and I really had no idea what I was going to do with them, but I love the patterns and the colors, and so I was able to figure out how I would bring that into my work. So the top of the dress on the spirit figure that's standing there, that's also a decorative paper, and a wood block, actually a fabric block, printing patterns on fabric is what you see on her skirt, and then charcoal drawing. The mask itself is a relief print that has been printed on top of a lithograph. And the lithograph is actually a slave ledger. And when we talk a little bit more, I'm going to talk a little bit more about identity. And so in terms of process, that's the type of layering that I like to do, because I firmly believe that when I'm working, if I can't paint it, then I can draw it. If I can't draw it, I'll print it. And if I can't do any of that, I'll collage it. So I like to leave myself open to be an artist. I don't want to go into the studio and be a printmaker or go in and be a painter. I want to go in and create.
So let's talk a little bit about Between Spirits and Sisters and the inspiration for this series and your research into the secret societies of women.
Yes. So typically I work in series, bodies of work, and each body of work is a conversation, really a continuous conversation from the previous body of work. And so this work actually started with a series of work that I did called I Come From Women Who Could Fly. And that body of work, kind of in brief, really talked about the women that I come from, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts, and all of those people who really helped to form who I am as an artist, as a mother, as a wife. And so to continue that conversation, there were several series that I've completed since then, but it all evolved to talk about women I was interested in women in secret societies, and I particularly looked at the Sande society, and looking at not just religion, but the practice of a lifestyle in terms of how we carry ourselves as women. Religion is also an aspect of it as well, but really looking at how we from the terms of the research, looking at how the Sande women carried themselves and how they were initiated into womanhood. And so I started thinking about how I grew up and how how I was initiated into womanhood. And so I began to think about the similarities between my religious upbringing and African-based religions, and those things that we do that we don't really realize where they came from. That historical memory that we have that we don't really know that we have. And so I became interested in secret society of women, but I wanted to look at it in terms of how we, particularly as African American women, become the spiritual other. And what does that space look like? What does that transition look like? And so the patterned background that you see is that space, the veil, that space between the waking world and the spiritual world. And when you see the patterns that go inside of the skin, you see this transition that's happening, this push and pull between the figure and the patterned background. That speaks about how we marry into that space, how we marry into that spiritual space. What does that look like? And so I use a lot of symbols in the work. The mask that you see here is one of them. And the mask is used as a tool, as a conduit for this transition to take place. And so, again, you see how the figure is going in and out of the background.
Yes, so I wanted you to expand just a little bit more on the spirit figure that's in this piece, and talk a little bit about that.
So when I initially started working, I've always worked with a figure, and the work was always influenced by women that I knew in my community. And so for me, memory works in terms of a snapshot. So I remember my grandmother's smile. What stands out to me the most about my mother is her lips. So all of these things would come together in my work to form women that they represent multiple women within our community. So the whole idea of the great mother icon. And so memory acts for me in terms of a snapshot. So then I started thinking about the work more in terms of, I became interested in how the spirit figure, the spirit women in my work, how do they interact with women, actual portraits, actual people that I know. And so I began to show up in the work myself. I began to photograph my mother, my cousins, and other women that are related to me and my family, because I wanted to show their spiritual transition and wanted them to interact with the spirit side of the work as well.
So this piece, the Sewing Hour, which was recently acquired by one of two pieces acquired by the Minneapolis Institute of Art. This is a self-portrait.
Yay!
Yes. Oh, it's on. Wow. Yeah, so this piece is absolutely, all of them are breathtakingly beautiful, but this one, unfortunately, you will not be able to experience. I know we're all going to go to the Institute, so it's not a loss. But just to stand before it is just in awe of the depth and the beauty that it possesses. And one of many of the elements that I love about this piece is the spirit figure that's to the left. And so I wanted you to talk about that. We're going to look at a short video clip of actually your making that, but talk to us about it. And then when we go to the video, you can kind of talk over it, so you can talk us through your process.
So I've only been back in Texas for about 4 years now. I moved away and I hadn't been home to visit a whole lot. So a friend of mine who I work with in letterpress printing, he said to me one day, it's going to be really interesting to see how your work changes when you move home and you're around your family more. And I just kind of thought about it. I was like, you know, you're right. Well, I go home, and again, I hadn't been home in years. I moved back, and I have these beautiful nieces who are grown, and I think I saw them maybe a few times when they were little, so they don't really, or they didn't really know me. And so my niece Erin comes into my studio as my assistant, and it was just really interesting and wonderful to develop a relationship with her and to field questions from her, and it was just to see her try and get to know me, wanting to get to know me, and me wanting to get to know her. And so I created this piece with us, and that's actually Erin, that is the spirit figure in this particular piece. And one of the distinguishing things between the spirit figure that you'll find in my work and the actual figures is that the spirit figure has some type of printing element to the body. And so again, the mask, me offering her this transition into this space, me teaching her things about life, teaching her about being a woman. And that's what a lot of our conversation was in the studio space. She would come in and, you know, I'm the cool aunt that she hadn't hung out with, and she's like, she'd pose questions to me just to see how I would react. So it was really nice to be able to develop that relationship with her and be able to talk to her about things. So let's look at a little bit of the video. As you can see, I got a little bit there, but I'll show you a trick that I use to kind of stop the ink from getting into spaces that I don't want it to get into. And we're going to take a quick peek here. And you can just see the print being able to come through. So it's going to be a lot more pressure. It's going to have to be added. So this is going to take a while.
Oops.
That is the next one.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So that's the
actual.
actual.
Go ahead.
You can see here the carving, and I used 2 linoleum blocks. I like to work really, really large. I kind of talked about that before. And so this is the linoleum block that I used. You can see the cutting tools there.
I'm sorry.
That's the actual drawing. So one of the things that I like to do in the studio is when I do drawings, I typically draw on something that is transparent or translucent. It makes thinking about printmaking, you're always thinking in the reverse, so it just makes it easier to think about the work in terms of transferring it to other blocks. I can just simply take the paper and just flip it over, and I don't have to gauge too much where my values are going to go and where they don't go. That's me again, working on the floor. I pulled several proofs there, so I'm kind of re-rolling it up. And I think at this point I had pretty much gotten it where I needed it to be, and just gonna, so you can kind of see what the actual print looked like.
Great. So let's talk about where the blues begins. And in this work, the beautiful headpiece has this wonderful hand stitching in it. So I want you to share with us how you learned those techniques and how that has impacted your work.
Yes, this is one of my favorite pieces. My grandmother was a quilter, and we spent a lot of time together making quilts and me helping her. And I was in charge of tacking and in charge of cutting out her fabric pieces. And so she taught me this one stitch, which she referred to as tacking, and then she would go back and she would make the more secure stitches. And during that time when I would work with her, she would tell me stories. She'd have a story about everything. And so the clothing that she would use, because she'd use a lot of old clothes that we had, she'd cut it up or have me cut it up, and she would work those into her quilts. And so she would tell me stories, and I began to associate people, places, and things with objects, which is where the symbols, the bowls and the birds and all of those things that you see in my work, the objects in my work come from. Is, her talking about, this is, a perfume bottle that my grandmother gave me or your aunt gave me or something like that. So all of these things began to be a visual language for me. And so I wanted to be able to share with the viewer an experience that I had with her, which was the sewing sessions that we had together. So, because at that point she was piecing together and sewing together, bringing together for me my history, my cultural history, my history of my community and family history. And so I wanted to be able to bring my stories together and pull those stories and hold them together in the way that she held them together for me. And so I used that one stitch, it's only one, that she taught me in all of the work. So it's nothing fancy, it's that one loop stitch that I use.
So let's talk a little bit about the symbolisms in your work and marrying of materials. So let's dissect this piece a little bit and start with our little bird here in the center. And of course that piece is here, so you'll be able to take it in.
So my grandmother loved birds. She loved animals, period. So I grew up with a lot of animals. We had birds, we had cats, we had raccoons and turtles and horses, and we just had everything. But birds were her favorite. And so we had birds where she would leave the cage open and they would fly around the house and play with us and things like that. And so the bird in my work is a symbol of the human spirit. And in my work, you'll see it in different forms. Sometimes it's more realistic than other times. It's stylized, but it represents the human spirit. The circle is a pattern that is repeated throughout all of my work. And for me, that's a symbol of a female, the symbol of the moon. And there's always a female presence in the work that I do, whether it's a male figure or a female figure. Predominantly. So I talked a little bit earlier about how I work from body to body of work and how each body of work really talks about or is a continued conversation from the previous body of work. Well, when I think about these conversations, I'm always thinking about how do I push the envelope? How do I expand this conversation to talk about, something different in a way? And so when you look at the background on this particular piece or that space, that in-between space, I wanted to really rethink how I created that space. So for a while, I worked with very loose, organic type patterns in the background. And then I could see these more tight, eventually I started working with tighter forms. And then I wanted to think about how do I rethink that space. So at this point you begin to see the larger shapes that appear in the background that begin to kind of redefine the space and shift the space in a different way. So this is one of the early pieces that you begin to see this happen in the work. The two figures in the work are my cousins. My cousin Nicole, here on the left, and that's her daughter. And I invited them to the studio because I really wanted to do an image of Nicole and her daughter, and to really talk about, she's always talking about how they hang out and things that they do, and just really seeing this mother-daughter relationship in bloom is like, wow, you know, I really want to talk about, that's something I want to talk about in my work. So I invited them to the studio, and I started photographing them. And I just thought this was a beautiful image of them sitting there in conversation, in this spiritual conversation, and, you know, her guiding her daughter, you know, navigating her in this space. And that's what I wanted to show in this piece.
Another object that we see in many of your works, the hoop earring. Talk to us about that.
It's a sign of, you know how we have rings and we have all of these things that say that we are a part of this group. Well, I have never not worn hoop earrings, small. I mean, I think I got my ears pierced when I was like 6 months old, and so I've been wearing hoop earrings ever since. And again, that idea of the woman, of saying I am a part of this group of women, these very proud, beautiful women, it shows that they are part of that. So it's kind of like that rite of passage where you have these earrings.
And other elements that play a strong role in your work is your color, your palette.
Yes.
Talk to us about your blues and your reds.
I am really drawn to the color blue. I believe that when we see colors, we react differently. I know I do, depending on the color. You know, reds for me and oranges are very energetic colors for me. Blue is very calming and soothing for me. Personally, it represents that space in general, just that in between, that spiritual space for me personally. And so it's very interesting. I don't think I realized how much how drawn I was to blue, and I started talking to my siblings one day, and my father had passed away some time ago, and we were looking back through family photographs, and I realized that we all wore blue, and his funeral was completely blue. And when I look back on periods of my life when something significant happened, you know, good or bad, there's always blue involved, and so that became I began to pay more attention and be more conscious of that color in my work.
So I love this piece, and we have a chance to revisit it in December. It was sold to clients who live in Boca Raton, and we were in Miami for Basel. And, you know, it's just breathtakingly beautiful. It's very large. It's 6 feet high and 12 feet across. So it's a really large piece. But I wanted to share this with everyone because it's not part of Between Spirits and Sisters, but another element or two elements that are running themes in Delita's work are the elaborate collars. This collar was created using beautiful decorative papers, and then the bowl, which is symbolic of, and I wanted you to share what the symbolism is behind that.
The bowl is a symbol of the womb. The idea that we carry something, we nurture it, and that becomes that talks about the womb and how we as women, you know, we carry this vessel, and we bring forth life, and we nurture it in that way. And so when you think about when you think about food and feeding, there's a spiritual feeding, there's a physical importance of feeding and just the whole idea of carrying that. So it became this thing of the womb for me. And this piece is actually really the beginning, part of the beginning of the conversation for spirits and sisters. And because again, the background pattern that I talked about, as you can see, is very different in terms that it's very loose, and you see certain patterns are tighter in certain areas and not. But this is where I begin to talk about the journey. I talk about the journey into that spiritual realm that women transition into. And so this piece began that conversation for me.
And you have one infant spiritual figure there,
Yes.
which most of them have been women and larger figures. So tell us about this figure.
Yes, there have been earlier pieces that I've done, and occasionally I bring children into the work. Not a whole lot, but when I put the bowl in, I really wanted to talk about the idea, again, of giving birth, the idea of nurturing the womb, but how we carry our young into that other space, how we carry them, how we transition them into their adulthood. And so I wanted to have the child present on that journey. You see the spirit figures, how our ancestors are with us all the time. When we, all through life, you know, we're always interacting with that spiritual space, and we just don't pay attention to it all the time, or we don't acknowledge it all the time, but it's always present and it's always there. And the boat itself becomes that symbol of the journey that we're going to.
So here is one of 3 firsts
Yes.
of works that you've created featuring men, and you've decided to bring men into the narrative. So tell us about this piece and who this gentleman is.
This is my son, Caleb. he's kind of ducking his head right now. Well, I wanted to bring men into the conversation. You know, I had a lot of people ask me, well, are you ever going to do any male pictures? Are you ever going to do any male pictures? And I'm like, yeah. You know, but I don't believe in forcing anything to happen. I feel like when they become a part of the conversation, they become a part of the conversation. And for me, that brings more value to it than just doing it because I can. I was working on a body of work, on this body of work, and my nephew passed away. And so I'm watching my mother and my sisters and my aunts, and I'm watching them interact with the men in my family, and you know, holding them up, being held up by them. And so I felt like it's time for them to be a part of this transitional conversation, the spiritual transition conversation that was happening. And so the first piece that I did was my husband, and the second piece was my son. And so I realized that, you know, he's my future. You know, he's the future for me. And I really wanted to talk about who he was as a person. He has a wonderful spirit about him. I've never told him this, but he's really an amazing kid. And he's always that kid I look up, you know, if there's someone at school that doesn't have a friend, he's it. You know, and I, you know, he's growing up, I give parties for him, and, you know, there's 2 sets of people there, you know, there's this popular crowd, and there's this crowd that's not popular, but he's going between the 2, and so I have him here holding the spirit, and holding all of these spirits, nurturing them in a way, and the pattern that I chose for him was a pattern that mimicked the universe. And how, you know, he's the future, that sense of goodness that's really out there.
Now here's hubby. I particularly love the title of this, and also that he's positioned on a stool, and I wanted you to talk about that a little bit too.
Yes, so I wanted I don't believe in just putting something on paper because you can. And so I really wanted to think about, you know, the women and the collars and the women and the mask. What is it that I felt was important about the men? What was it that I really wanted to say about them? And what was it I wanted to say about him? And having him be the support system that he's been, throughout my career as an artist, throughout our marriage, I felt like this idea of balance, this idea of him sitting on this throne and offering this stability. And so the men in the figures that I have are sitting on golden stools. So that has become a symbol that has been added to my vocabulary in my work.
And this piece, another one, each one I look at I love, so I'm biased, I can't help it. It's just so amazing. So, you've used the mask as a device to convey several narratives, the preservation of traditions, religious convictions, sacred bonds, and spirituality. In those things between us, you are the mask figure, positioned in the background of the piece. The woman in the foreground possesses an outward gaze. So tell us about the relationship between the two women. Are you the spirited figure in this piece?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I am. And the young lady sitting in the front is my niece, Catherine. And she's actually Aaron's sister. And of the two, she's the most strong-willed. And so I positioned her in a way that I hoped would convey, this will that she has. And again, getting to know her in the way that I got to know her sister. In the piece is called Those Things Between Us. And me taking on this spiritual role, and she's just become a young mother, so she has 2 little ones, and I get text messages from her all the time. How did you potty train? What did you do? And so again, offering her that advice, and there have been conversations that we've had that have been more on a spiritual level, and I think this piece for me represents us in the role that I play and the role that she has in those conversations that take place.
So while I'm so fortunate to be able to live with this work for several weeks now, and I come down and I have conversations with them too. So like your mom and I, like when we went to Basel, I put mom here because, and then your hubby was over here because I said, all right, we're going to be gone. You need to take care of the space. I want your energy in here to watch over everything in our absence. And of course, mom took care of everything. And Cedric was the censor at the door. So, but her gaze, and I've looked into her eyes many times, and I wonder what it is that she's saying. I mean, everyone has their own conversation with her and experience as they're, viewing the piece and what they bring to it. But I wondered if you could share with us what you think that she might say to us.
What I take away from Catherine is she's very observant, but she has this sense of, she has her own mind. She knows what she wants to do. She knows how, I'm going to do it this way. She's always had this sense of, I'm going to do it this way. And I'm constantly telling her, talk to me, please, before you do something that might not be what you really want to do. And, again, she's a beautiful person. She has a beautiful heart, but she has this sense of, I'm going to fake it until I make it because I don't want you to think that, I can't do it. And so when I look at this piece, when she posed for me for this piece, because I had her come in and pose, we were actually planning her wedding at the time. And I'm like, you might not really want to do that, that whole thing. And she's sitting there like, well, if you say so. And so again, that spiritual guidance, the fact that I've been through things that she has not been through, and I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to let you do what you need to do, but I'm still here for you. And so I kind of made that step back in the background to kind of wait for her to to do what she needs to do to transition.
Yeah, I sensed that she was sassy.
Yes.
So,
Very sassy.
yeah. So I wanted to open the floor for questions now. If anyone has any questions for Delita, I'll let Iris pass the mic.
Okay.
I do, but it's about construction.
Mhm.
I noticed that your use of,
Gloria, would you use the mic?
I noticed that your use of black and white
Mhm.
is very purposeful.
Yes.
How do you use them? What does that mean in the context of the work?
For a really long time, I stayed away from color. I had this, I guess, pretty traumatic experience. Growing up in elementary school, I was told that I was using color incorrectly, but I wasn't, quote unquote, shown how to use color. So I actually didn't get back into using color until graduate school. And they were like, experiment. And I was like, okay, so as you can see, I went crazy. And I was really excited to get back in color, but I think that the use of black and white is kind of more because of something that it's repetitive. It's something that I've done so long, and particularly with the figure, working with the figure, so it's become habit. So color is fairly new again for me. So
You use the different tones of white.
I do use different tones of white, but it has more to do with how it ends up with the color that I use. Because a lot of times the white is laid on top of a different color, and you have colors that are more transparent colors and more opaque colors. So it depends on what type of white that I use. When I use the eye, particularly when I work with the eyes, the whites of the eyes are always painted in, and it's always an opaque color. When I use white to overlay on...
Considering myself being an example.
Yes. When I use white on top of a pattern or with another pattern, it's usually more of a transparent white, because I want something else to come through or something else to show.
I have a comment. Thanks. I was fortunate enough to be at Basel and saw the piece that you were talking about, Myrtis, at your gallery down there, your booth, and it was exquisite. The image doesn't do it justice that you have on the screen. I just wanted to share, I shared this with Delita down in Miami, but I'll share it with the group. She's in good company. She's in the collection of Brenda Thompson, and if you guys know who she is, she has a massive African-American art collection. And she's going to be in the exhibit at the Driscoll Center next fall. They asked different collectors in the area to send them 8 images. And so I was selected in that group. And so I primarily collect the masters. So I sent Duncanson, Bannister, Porter, and I said, you know, I'm going to send Delita's piece because I'm advancing into contemporary work now. And that was the first piece that they selected. And so I teased Delita down in Miami. I said, wow. I said, they bypassed my Duncanson, my Bannister, and selected your beautiful piece called Constellation, which is in my collection. So her work is exquisite, as you all can tell when you walk through here. And I really think that she's going to really skyrocket. She's already skyrocketing, because the price I paid for her work, you can't get it now for that price. So I just wanted to share that with you guys, that you need to hop on art before I wish I had done that with Amy Sherrod. She was here at Myrtis's gallery, and I didn't do it. So I just wanted to share that with you all. And I just absolutely love Delita, and I love Myrtis. So.
Hi. Hello.
I know that tomorrow's conversation talks more about your inspiration from Daughters of the Dust, but I'm wondering if the same piece, Night Traveler, was inspired by that film. With the women coming in on the boat, it directly reminded me of that opening scene, and I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about it, if it does?
It does. I get inspiration from a lot of different sources. You know, a lot of people are like, well, I'm a painter, so I'm going to look at a lot of different painters. Well, for me, I look at sculptors. I look at letterpress type work. I read particularly sci-fi books. I get inspiration from everywhere. I think that you can pull inspiration from anything, anywhere, any place. So that was influenced by that, and you know, as a lot of the work in work that I create was influenced by that movie.
Anybody else?
Hello. What, like, master artists, so to speak, did you study, and how do you, like, incorporate what you've learned from them into your work that you have today?
That's a great question. I look at a lot of different artists, but the artists that I really consider to be my masters that I look at, John Biggers, of course, Elizabeth Catlett, absolutely, Doc's Thrash, I look at Gauguin, I look at Motherwell, Jim Dine. I look at a lot of different artists for a lot of different things. So when I say that Jim Dine is an artist, a printmaker that I look at because of the movement in his work. I love his mark making, his aggressiveness with his mark making. Elizabeth Catlett, I look at her work because I love her mark making, but I love her sense of community and her sense of protest through her work. So again, looking at a lot of different sources, I don't want to mimic another artist. I want to understand that artist, and I want to take the concept of what they're doing and study it and look at my work and say, okay, how do I get the essence, the true understanding of what they're doing and translate it into my work to where it's my own.
Hi, Delita.
Hello.
You know, it's so interesting. Okay. When you were talking about wanting to view the painting and have it through you, I was thinking more about the eyes and the color of eyes, and I went earlier this week to the Lynette, I always mispronounce her name, Yadom
Yes.
Bawach exhibit in New York, and it's so interesting to me to see the parallels between what she does with eyes and what you do with eyes. I don't know if that has struck you.
I love her work.
Yeah. But the other thing I'd like you to talk about is it's interesting to hear that Doc's Thrash is somebody that you look at, because I happen to have both a Doc's Thrash and some Delita's work. So I'd love to hear more about what you take from his work.
Well, I studied his work when I first got into graduate school, was when I was really introduced to his work. And I was drawn into the fact that he was a printmaker, of course, and he basically invented the Carborundum print process. And so I did a lot of research trying to figure out, you know, were there any writings that he did, any papers that were left in terms of how he invented this process or how he came up with this process. In terms of looking at the work itself, I was really drawn to the, I don't want to say heaviness of the work because it's not really heavy, but it's very strong. The figures in his work is very strong. The landscapes that I saw him do, or the scenery that I saw him do, I was very much drawn to that as well. The dark, rich blackness of the prints that he produced, I love that. And when you look at the figures, in my work, you see that darkness, you see the strong figures in the face and the pronounced, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and things like that. So that's what drew me to his work.
Delita,
Yes.
we're talking about influences right now, and I'm very curious when I look at the work and the scale, the colors. I'm wondering, perhaps in the studio, what kind of music it seems like I'm hearing things, and I look at, I think of jazz musicians and all sorts of sounds, and that may be appropriate for the color and your inspiration. So could you talk about that? And also a little bit about coming back to Texas.
Okay, so in terms of studio, it's interesting because I like music, but I really don't like to listen to it in the studio. So I listen to a lot of lectures. I listen to poetry readings. So when you're in my studio, you see all these little notes on the floor, on the walls, stickies everywhere. And when I'm listening to these lectures, it helps me to pose questions that I need to be asking in my own work. And so that's what you see, statements and questions and comments based on things that I'm hearing. So when I do listen to music, I do listen to some jazz. I listen to Afro-Cuban jazz mostly, and a few other things, but not a whole lot. It's mostly poetry readings, lectures, and artist talks that I listen to. Coming back to Texas was good. It was different. I came back and we purposely are outside of the city. And it's great for me to be able to work and get work produced. But it was good coming home to family. I'll say that much. It was wonderful. But I actually miss Arkansas a lot. Met some amazing, wonderful people there that is still like family. And it's always like going home whenever I go there to visit as well.
Whose works among your peers do you admire?
This beautiful young lady here, Latoya Hobbs, I absolutely love her work. She is a phenomenal printmaker, and so I often troll her page on whether she knows it or not. I look at Jamia, her work, Amy Sherrill, of course. Deborah Roberts is another artist that I look at. Just actually, like, going to Basel is always fun for me because all those people that you connect with on social media and you see their work, we all get excited because we get to go to Miami and we get to meet each other and we get to see each other and like really talk to each other about our work. So yeah, there's like a ton of people that I look at that are, people I grew up with, I say.
Hi, Delita. I really like your art, especially your son. He seems like a cool guy. So my question is, I saw in one of your paintings you had, it was about the spiritual transition, or the transition into spiritual space of womanhood. And I wanted to know, what does that spiritual space itself look like, and how is it represented in your pieces?
That transition is the space itself is the patterns that you see in the work. And when you think about how each figure transitions in that space, you're looking at how the figure itself marries with that and merges with that, with those patterns. So when I think about, spirituality, I think about the diverseness of, spirituality, the various religions, the various practices. And so throughout my work, you see various patterns and colors and shapes and forms and all these things, and then you have the individual and you see them, you see the patterns go in and out of the figure and how they merge together in different ways. So that's what it visually looks like for me.
So I just wanted to share with you all how Delita and I came to meet. My husband and I attended a private gathering at the Crystal Bridges Museum. I was sent an invitation to attend a program/tour, and we were there with other museum curators from across the country. We were the only people of color in the room. And I was like, wow, I don't know how I got on that list. So we're taking the tour, and at the time, the State of the Art exhibition was up. It was an exhibition that featured the work of contemporary artists. The director and I think one of the curators had gone across the country and gathered the work of all these great artists, and that became this wonderful traveling exhibition. So I walk into this room, and there's Delita's piece. And I just kept going back to it and back to it. I had not heard about her, did not know who she was, I knew nothing of her work. And then I was flying somewhere else on a different trip and grabbed a copy of the International Review of African American Art out of Hampton University. And it said, like, the 10 artists to watch, and there she was amongst them. And I said, okay, God, 2 times, I'm calling. So I think I emailed you first.
Yes.
And then it was so wonderful. We spoke like immediately thereafter. And she goes, I've been watching your gallery. And I'm like, oh my God. So it was a love fest from the beginning.
Yes, it was wonderful when she called. But I have to tell you about actually being in that show. It's pretty funny. I had actually left the university. I taught at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock for like 6 years. And I decided that with some encouragement from my husband that I'm just going to go into the studio full time. And so I took the leap, and I get this email from Chad Alligood, who was the curator at the time, and he had been working, I think, for like a year, pulling together the State of the Art exhibition. And I honestly had no idea who he was, and he asked to come visit the studio, and I was like, sure, why not? And so I'm working, and I get an email, a follow-up email that said, hey, I just want to confirm that we're still on for this. And I was like, yeah, we're still on, and I'm thinking, I should probably look this guy up. So I look him up, and it says he's with Crystal Bridges, Museum of American Art. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And didn't think anything of it. He comes and he says, is it okay if I video this? And I'm like, sure, no problem. And, the visit went really well. So maybe about 3 or 4 months later, I am sitting in bed, and it was, evening, and I'm watching, Ancient Aliens, and I'm sitting there, and I get this. Yes, that's my guilty pleasure. And I'm watching Ancient Aliens, and my phone just starts going crazy, and people are like, hey, congratulations on your Huffington Post interview. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So I Googled myself, and like Huffington Post, Delita Martin, and there was the video. And so I was like, I should probably figure out what's going on. So I started, looking up Chad at the museum, and I was like, and I told my husband, I was like, babe, do you think they were like, he's like, you gotta be a part of the exhibition. I'm like, are you sure? He said, well, they wouldn't have put the interview up there. And I was like, I don't want to call and ask, and I don't want to say anything if it's not so. So they called me back, and they said, well, we'd like to come and, take some pictures and video. And I was like, sure. And I'm still in my mind thinking, am I part of this or not? No one said anything. And so they come back, and the young lady's like, well, so, how does it feel to be, a part of this 101 artists? I was like, well, now that you confirmed it for me, now that it's been confirmed, it's me. So it was a wonderful experience, and I got to, work with Myrtis out of it, so it was really great.
Thank you. So I'm going to conclude our discussion with just a couple of follow-up things. One, we hope that, weather permitting, you'll be able to join us for the screening of Daughters of the Dust. And it will be a totally different conversation about the film and its influence on Delita's work. We also are proud to announce that we have been officially accepted into the 13th annual Havana Biennale, and Delita is one of the artists. So that project, Building Bridges, Politics, Race and Love, or probably Identity, Race, Love, I've got title probably not so correct, but so that will happen April 12th. It opens in Havana. So we are exhibiting at an amazing gallery space there, Galerie Montillo. So really excited about that. There's a lot of activity swirling around in my head in terms of planning, but it's all going to come together, Lord. It really is. It's just a lot to coordinate. Two of our artists are currently at Loyola University's Julio Fine Arts show and the No Language exhibition. That's Tony Chapman and Wesley Clark. And there's some little flyers there that you can take along with you. And we thank you again for coming. There are so many wonderful things happening here in our space. We are so honored to be representing Delita, and we have a stable of incredibly talented artists that we love for you all to come back at different times and experience and, indulge in their work in the way that we do. So thank you all. Delita, this is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.